Hey friends, Patrina here with Homegrown Florida. In just one short month, I'm going to be heading out on one of my extended RV trips. So I thought it would be fun to do some ready-made meals. So instead of packing something like this, that doesn't taste great and also just has a lot of stuff that's artificial or, not healthy for us, too much sodium, those kinds of things, I decided to make my own freeze-dried, ready-to-eat meals that we're gonna take with us. I made 5 different homemade meals with a lot of my homegrown veggies from the garden. I'm gonna show you today how I did it. Probably one of the things that really drew me to freeze drying as opposed to canning or dehydrating was the fact that you can do whole meals. And so I've been wanting to do this recipe for a while, but being new to freeze drying, I wanted to test things out first. So I had done like some mashed potatoes. I did some mashed sweet potatoes. I've done some like sides, but this is the first day that I've done like full-blown meals. And I really like it because you don't have to follow a recipe like with canning. You can actually do your favorite meals. And you just got to keep a couple things in mind. So one of the first things you got to keep in mind is fat and sugar. So I made ground beef, and when I purchased this ground beef, I made sure that the ground beef was the lowest fat. So I think it was like 93.7. And then after I was done cooking the ground beef, I run it through some hot water. So I drained off all the fat and then I rinsed it with hot water. Now I don't typically do that with any of my meat, but I was really trying to get rid of all of the fat. The other thing I was really focused on when I was making the spaghetti and meat sauce was the noodles. These are going to be reconstituted or rehydrated with hot water, and noodles are notorious for being overcooked, especially when they're cooked twice, like is basically what's going to happen here when I rehydrate them. So I wanted to make sure that I cooked the noodles perfectly, and by perfectly I mean somewhat on the over al dente side, so to where when you take a bite out of it, it still has some crispness to it. So that way, when I add the hot water and I reheat these noodles, that they won't be like super mushy. That's my goal. In this next recipe, I'm going to be boiling chicken. Now, I don't typically boil chicken. I think this is probably the worst way that you can cook chicken, but I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. I wanted to use chicken thighs because I felt like it would be tastier, but chicken thighs have more fat. And like we talked about earlier, you really want to avoid fat. And so I felt like by boiling it, I would boil off some of the fat into the water, and also it's actually easier to kind of get the fat off the chicken once it's boiled. I'll show you that in a minute. The other thing you want to take into consideration when you're freeze drying is how you're cutting your vegetables. So the cool thing here is these potatoes are from my potato harvest that we have been figuring out a way to store them, and they look so great. This is those refrigerator potatoes. The carrots I did have to purchase because my carrots are canned at this point, and I just wanted a fresh carrot for this recipe. The onions and then the garlic that I use later on, those are all from the garden. When I'm chopping these vegetables, I'm trying to chop them into a small dice. So that includes the onions, the carrots, and the potatoes. Everything needs to be a small piece because they're just going to freeze dry a lot faster, and you're going to avoid the possibility that things didn't get freeze dried properly by using small pieces. The bigger the piece, the harder it is for the freeze dryer to work, and the more likelihood that you could accidentally think that something is freeze dried and it's not, and then it goes bad inside the Mylar bag. We're going to get these veggies cooking. I usually saute veggies like this when I'm going to make a soup, and this is going to be a chicken noodle soup. But being as I wanted to reduce the fat in these recipes, I am actually not going to be using butter, and instead I'm using some homemade chicken broth. There is a little bit of fat you can see in that broth, but I'm not really worried about a small amount. And we're going to add some celery and some peas from the garden. After I harvested these, I had blanched them, and then I vacuum sealed them, and they've been sitting in my freezer. Peas do really well for this. I think the celery is fine. It definitely did not hold any of its crispness in the freezer, but it's giving that flavor, which is what I'm going for. And then we're just going to season with some salt and some pepper. And then I personally love to put garlic powder and onion powder in pretty much everything, so you're probably going to see that repeated multiple times in here. Now once the chicken is done cooking, I am going to dice it up. I'm struggling a little bit here. This knife that I have, I just can't seem to get it sharp with my sharpener, but I'm going to keep working on that. But as I'm going through this, I'm kind of looking at the chicken and making sure that I'm pulling off any of the fat. And the fat comes off so easy, it just kind of peels right off. And that is what's going to help my freeze dryer get the meat freeze dried perfectly and preserved perfectly so that I don't have issues later on. The other thing I wanted to do with this recipe is I wanted to boil the noodles separately. I'm using an egg noodle. Typically, when I make a soup, I'm just going to add whatever grain I'm using, whether that's pasta or rice or whatever, in the soup and let it cook in the soup. But once again, like we were talking about, I really want the al dente side of the egg noodles. And egg noodles cook so super fast. I was really worried about these becoming overcooked just as part of the original cooking process. Now, I didn't want that to happen, so that's why I cooked them separately. And then I'm going to lay them on the trays. I'm not adding a significant amount of the soup base part because I can always heat this back up with broth, or you can just use water, whichever you prefer. I am weighing my trays here because I did notice that when you are doing a whole meal like what I'm doing here, it is very easy to overweight these trays. I think my trays, they're between, you're supposed to keep them under 2 to 2.5 pounds. And so I was right at like 2.25 pounds is what I was aiming for all of these trays. That's the recommendation by Harvest Right. This next recipe, I am doing a very traditional rice and beans. This one's not going to actually have any meat in it, but I'm going to start by cooking all my rice. I actually have 2 recipes that I'm doing freeze drying that call for rice, so I'm cooking all my rice at the same time. I did this with my ground beef and I did this with my chicken as well. You probably saw me only use about half the chicken earlier because I have another recipe that is going to call for the rest of that chicken. This is how I batch process food, whether I'm doing freeze-dried whole meals or whether I'm doing like meal prep for the week. I tend to cook all the pasta, all the rice, all the meat, all together, and then I will later add my seasonings and then my vegetables and things like that. Here we have some frozen hot and sweet peppers because I want it to be a bit on the spicy side, so I'm using a mix of both. I'm also adding in some cooked Puerto Rican black beans. I grow these over the summer. They do so well in our Florida summers. Now, the way that I cook my black beans is I usually just cook them through the canning process. So these have to be pressure canned. So I usually soak them overnight, and then the next day I fill a quart-sized jar with 1 cup of beans, and then I fill the rest of it with boiling water, and then I pressure can it. I believe it's either 70 minutes or 90 minutes. I'll have to take a look at that. And that cooks them, and then we can just pull them straight out of the jar and eat them however we want. The rice is done now, so I added, I think it was about 3 cups of rice into the vegetables, and I'm going to add a little bit of broth to this just to loosen up that rice. I'm adding my favorite seasoning for rice and beans, which is Sazon, and then we're going to do regular salt and pepper. I'm really hoping that it's the heat from the peppers that come out in this rice and bean recipe rather than like a whole bunch of different seasonings. But you can definitely add a lot more seasoning. You can add some cayenne, you can add, some adobe, you can add all kinds of different seasoning. It's really up to you, but I wanted to keep it pretty simple for this particular recipe. And then we're putting it on the trays, and once again, we're aiming for that 2 to 2.5 pounds of food. I have my scale underneath the tray just to keep me accountable here. Now this next recipe I was so excited to do because I'm basically doing a chicken and dumpling. And I'm just like so excited to see how this turns out. So to make chicken and dumpling, you have to make like a thick stew. It's very similar to making a pot pie filling. So you start with your vegetables. I did carrots, onions, peas, celery. Then I added a little bit of butter. Now, once again, I'm aiming not to use a lot, so I probably used 1/3 of the amount of butter that I normally use, and then I think it was about 1/2 cup of flour. And I let that cook down in the pan for a couple of minutes before I added my first little round of broth, just to kind of loosen everything up. And then I'm going to add more broth And this is going to cook for a little bit, let those veggies kind of soften. And then after it's cooked for a bit, it will start to thicken. I didn't notice the thickening until later on. I felt like it took a lot longer to thicken than it normally does, but by the time it was done in the oven, it was completely fine. Now the last component that I added to this dish was frozen peas. You don't really want to put frozen peas in at the beginning because then they just mush and turn to absolutely nothing. So I break them up right before I take the soup off of the heat. And then I'm adding my chicken back. This doesn't even need to cook. This is already pre-cooked, so I'm not looking to even heat it up. It doesn't matter because it's going to be freeze-dried, so it's basically going to be frozen. Pour that whole mixture into a baking dish, and as you can see here, it's not really thick, so I was a little bit worried, but by the time it's done, it is absolutely perfect. Now, the one thing I cheated on here, typically I make my biscuits from scratch. I absolutely love Becky over at Acres Homestead. She has a biscuit recipe that is to die for, out of this world. It's so good, so easy to make. Normally, that's the biscuits I make. But I was making so many recipes, I knew I was going to be exhausted by the end of this, so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to get the can of biscuits and do it that way. So you can totally make your biscuits, and you know, when they're in the doughy stage, that's where you add them in here for the dumpling part. And you're going to stick that in the oven at 350. I think it took mine about 30 minutes, maybe 35 minutes. When it comes out, you want this to cool completely. You do not want to put this in the freeze dryer or in the trays when it's hot, because number one, that filling is not thick at that point. It's just going to be like a soupy mixture. What I wanted is like a thick casserole style texture. And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm actually going to separate the biscuits because I wasn't exactly sure how they would freeze dry. Now, I've done bread in the freeze dryer. It's actually one of the first things that Harvest Right tells you to do is a bread run, because when you first get your freeze dryer, it still has like its electrical components and it kind of gives off like a weird smell the first time you do it. And so they tell you to do a bread run, so just loaves of bread. And that really freeze dries really, really well. So I assumed that biscuits would freeze dry similar to breads, and it does. It actually freeze dries very, very easily. I thought that was outstanding. But I didn't want them to touch, because when they're completely freeze dried, they basically just crumble. And I wanted this to rehydrate as whole pieces. So I separated them when I put them on the tray, so that way when they were freeze dried, I'm kind of looking ahead, making sure that I can take the whole pieces of biscuit and put them in my Mylar bag, rather than, you know, breaking them into a little dust, and then they just become, you know, just part of a soup. The last recipe we're going to make is unstuffed peppers. So it's just like a stuffed pepper, but instead of having whole peppers, you are using, you know, pepper pieces. And I took out all of these sweet peppers that I had from the garden harvest this summer, and I'm putting, I don't know how much that was, probably about 2 cups of peppers in there. And then we're going to add in our rice. This is the rice that we made earlier for the rice and beans recipe. I forgot to film it, but I also put in a can of stewed tomatoes. This was tomatoes that we made together from our tomato harvest in the spring. And I probably just put 1 pint-sized jar in with the juices, because I wanted the juice of the tomatoes. Next, we're adding in some of that ground beef that we drained off so that it has no fat whatsoever. And then you'll just add your seasonings, whatever you'd like here. I think I went with cumin, adobo, and just some salt and pepper, keeping it really simple this first time. Like with the rice and beans, we're adding it to the tray and we're measuring out, making sure that we have the 2 to 2.5 pounds of the unstuffed pepper mixture. And I can't believe I almost forgot the most important part of an unstuffed pepper, which is cheese. I'm so glad I caught it. So I just added cheese kind of to the top of the tray, and it worked out just fine. You don't have to like mix it in. It can be in layers, but I can't believe I almost forgot that. Now it's time to stick these guys in the freeze dryer, and there is a method to this madness here. I wanted to put the things that I thought would take the longest to freeze dry in the center slots. The top slot and the bottom slot tends to not freeze dry as quickly as the middle slots. So I took the ones with rice. So the rice and beans and the unstuffed peppers were the ones that I put on the top and bottom. Rice seems to freeze dry very, very fast. But the dumplings, the spaghetti, And then the soup, because it has a lot of water in it, I put into the middle trays. The other option that you can do when you're freeze drying is you can put them on whatever trays you want or whatever slots you want. And then as they're freeze drying and you're checking on them, you then, move the trays around. It took, I think, 44 hours to freeze dry, although I think it was done a lot sooner. I had checked on it right when I went to bed, and I weigh my trays. I weigh them in between each like 4 to 6 hour cycle, and I check to see, is it still losing weight? And that's how you know if it's not done freeze drying, is if it's still losing that weight, it means that there's still water in the food when you weigh the trays. When I weighed my trays before I went to bed, they weren't really losing any weight. I think they had lost like a tenth of an ounce, which isn't very a lot. But I thought, let me just let it run overnight. And when I wake up in the morning, I'll deal with all this. And I'm glad I did that because I did notice that there were a couple of them, like the spaghetti sauce and the biscuit one, that did lose another ounce of weight by letting it go a little bit further. So it's one of those things with freeze drying that you really don't want to go too quickly. Let it run as long as possible. So here I am breaking up the biscuits, and this is what I was foreseeing. I was foreseeing that these pieces were going to be fairly big and that I didn't really want to break the biscuit parts in pieces. So I'm glad I had that thought in the beginning to separate the biscuits instead of having them touch, because otherwise they would have all broken up into pieces and I wouldn't have had this really cool, biscuit in each one of the pieces of the chicken and dumpling. I'm using two different kinds of Mylar bags with these recipes. So one of them is the quart size bags, and then recently I had purchased the gallon size bags. And I think the gallon size bags work better for what we use them for. I don't know, the quarts just seem too small. It's almost like, it's like 1.5 quarts is a tray of food in the freeze dryer. And that always leaves me with this like extra bag or bag that's not full. And I don't like to do that. So moving to a gallon size bag pretty much fits an entire tray. And so when it came to the meals that we could eat as a like soup, like the chicken noodle soup, the rice and beans, and the unstuffed peppers, I put all those in the 1 gallon bags and they fit beautifully. For the other items where I kind of wanted them to be one serving, like the biscuits and the spaghetti, I put those into the quart size bags. But I think we're definitely moving to gallon size bags from here on forward. I'm using an oxygen absorber in each one of the bags. I think this is a 700 cc oxygen absorber. Hopefully I had that correct, but it's basically the ones that Harvest Right sells 50 in a pack. Now you don't have to use Mylar bags to store your freeze-dried food. You can use glass jars and then vacuum seal them. What I'm using here is a Mylar bag sealer. I like to use the Mylar with the oxygen absorber and the sealer, the heat sealer here, when I'm planning on these guys needing to last for a while, because when you properly store them in Mylar bags versus in glass jars, they can last for 30 years, which is really, really cool. In the glass jars, you're still going to get quite a bit of time out of them, but you're not going to quite get that full 30 years. I'm not planning on keeping these for 30 years. These are for camping, but it's still nice to have. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today while we cooked and freeze-dried everything. I had a great time. I hope you did too. If you're going to try any of these recipes, head down in the comments and let me know.